It is a strange thing about humility. The moment you believe you have attained it, you have already lost it. A man who declares himself humble is rather like a man who boasts that he is honest. It is the sort of thing that withers the instant it is spoken aloud. Yet, humility is not what most of us imagine. Too often we mistake it for weakness, or a dreary self-deprecation, or the habit of speaking poorly about oneself so as to invite contradiction. But true humility is of an entirely different nature. It is not thinking less of ourselves, as though we were worms crawling in the dust, but rather thinking of ourselves less, so that the gaze of our heart is lifted upwards to God and outwards to our neighbor. Humility frees us, not by shrinking us, but by unburdening us from the suffocating weight of self-obsession. When I speak of humility, I do not mean that ghastly counterfeit which is so often paraded in polite company, a shallow modesty, ever eager to assure others that one is not really clever or not really accomplished, all the while fishing for praise. No, that is but pride disguised in tattered clothing. The humble man does not need to deny the gifts God has given him, any more than a violinist must deny the beauty of music when his instrument sings. Rather, humility is simply truth. To see ourselves as we really are, no more and no less, creatures dependent on God, and children infinitely loved. You see, pride turns us inward, as though the whole world were a mirror reflecting only our own importance. It whispers constantly, "What are they thinking of me? How am I being regarded? Am I superior or inferior to this person?" And so, pride bends the soul inward until it can scarcely look outwards at all. But humility, on the other hand, opens windows in the soul. It releases us from the endless game of comparison, so that we might at last behold what is beyond us, the grandeur of God, the beauty of creation, and the preciousness of every other soul. Think of a child delighted in play. He does not stop to wonder how impressive he appears while building his tower of blocks. His joy is unself-conscious. He is simply absorbed in the wonder of the thing itself. That is humility, a forgetting of self, not through effort or repression, but through the glad discovery that there are far lovelier things than self to occupy the mind. It is no accident that Christ, who is the truth, described himself as gentle and lowly in heart. For humility is nothing less than the fragrance of Christ himself, and it is through humility that the Christian life becomes possible at all. For how could one receive grace except by the open hands of the humble? How could one forgive an enemy except by laying aside the bruised ego? How could one serve the least except by ceasing to ask, "What is in this for me?" Indeed, humility is the key that unlocks all other virtues. Courage without humility becomes reckless arrogance. Love without humility becomes possessive and controlling. Even faith without humility may turn into a demand rather than a trust. It is humility that keeps our virtues rooted in God rather than inflated by self. There is a paradox here, one that only humility can teach. The more we forget ourselves, the more truly ourselves we become. For our true identity does not lie in that anxious self-image we try so desperately to maintain. It lies hidden with Christ in God. Humility is not the erasure of the self, but the unveiling of the true self, the self that is most real when surrendered to its Maker. And perhaps this is why humility, far from being a dreary denial of life, is in fact the wellspring of joy. For the proud man is always restless, forever concerned with his reputation, easily offended, endlessly in need of proving himself. But the humble man, precisely because he has stopped staring at himself, is free to laugh, free to delight in the smallest gifts, free to lose himself in the music of life and, above all, free to adore the giver of life. It may help to think of humility as a kind of vision. Pride blurs our sight, crowding our field of vision with the looming figure of self. Humility clears the lens, and suddenly we see. We see the heavens declaring the glory of God. We see our neighbors not as competitors, but as fellow travelers. We see the beauty of the world, which pride had dulled. Most importantly, we see God as He is, high and lifted up, and ourselves as creatures upheld by mercy. Pride, I have often thought, is like a fog. It is dense and close about us, distorting all proportions. It makes mountains out of molehills when our own dignity is at stake, and it reduces vast landscapes to shadows whenever the glory of God is in view. In pride, we lose the true scale of things, for everything becomes measured in reference to ourselves. Humility, however, is the great clarifier. It parts the fog, revealing the mountains as mountains, the valleys as valleys, and God as God. It restores to us the proper proportion of reality, that we are small, yet cherished, that the universe does not revolve around us, and yet the maker of that universe stoops to number the hairs on our head. The Scriptures tell us that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That word resists is a strong one. It is not merely that God frowns upon pride, but that pride places us at cross purposes with the very heart of God. For the proud soul cannot receive. Its hands are clenched, its heart barricaded, its gaze forever upon itself. The humble soul, however, is open, like the earth that thirsts for rain, like a window that welcomes in the light. Grace, after all, is always a gift, never a possession. It flows most freely where there is least resistance, and resistance is always born of pride. One might imagine humility as a vessel floating upon the sea. The vessel does not create the water that sustains it, nor does it command the tides. Its strength lies in its capacity to remain open, to remain borne along by that which is greater than itself. The proud man tries to be the sea, and in doing so, he drowns. But let me be clear. Humility is not cowardice. It is not passivity. It is not the abdication of the self, as though God delighted in erasing the personalities He has so carefully formed. On the contrary, humility is courage of the rarest kind, the courage to step outside the tyranny of self, to lose the obsessive need for control, to trust oneself into the hands of God. The saints were not timid men and women. They were ablaze with courage. And yet their courage did not come from boasting in their own strength, but from knowing that the strength of Christ was made perfect in their weakness. When we humble ourselves, we enter into reality. For what could be more foolish than to imagine that the cosmos is arranged for our applause? Humility is simply the choice to live in truth, that God is God, and we are not. And in that truth lies freedom. The proud man must always defend his crown, but the humble man who has laid his crown at the feet of Christ no longer fears its loss. If ever you have stood upon a cliffside gazing out across the endless sea or the sweeping expanse of stars, You may have felt a curious sensation, smallness mingled with wonder. It is not despairing smallness, as though one were insignificant. It is liberating smallness, the realization that you are part of something vast, beautiful, and purposeful beyond comprehension. That sensation is akin to humility. It is the joy of forgetting self, of being caught up into the grandeur of God's reality. And herein lies another paradox. Humility makes love possible. For so long as we are preoccupied with ourselves, our reputation, our superiority, our inferiority, we cannot truly behold another. The proud man sees people as rivals, or as props to support his own self-image. The humble man sees people as souls of infinite worth, as mysteries made in the image of God. Only when we forget ourselves are we free to love without calculation, without the exhausting arithmetic of, "What does this gain me?" Humility is, in this sense, the very air of heaven. For in heaven there is no competition, no envy, no clamor for recognition. The saints do not jostle for position in the kingdom. Their gaze is too captivated by the Lamb upon the throne. And so, if we would prepare ourselves for heaven, we must learn humility now. We must practice the art of stepping aside from ourselves, of letting Christ increase as we decrease. There is, of course, a difficulty. For the moment we begin to practice humility, pride crouches at the door. We take secret satisfaction in our own supposed modesty. We congratulate ourselves for being humble. How, then, are we to grow in humility without becoming proud of it? The answer, I think, lies in distraction. Not distraction in the trivial sense, but in the holy sense of being distracted away from ourselves and toward God and neighbor. We do not become humble by staring at humility, any more than one becomes healthy by staring at one's pulse. We become humble by loving something greater than self until self fades into its proper place. The cure for pride is worship, for in worship we finally take our eyes off ourselves. We turn them upward to the one who alone deserves all glory, and in that act we discover the relief of self-forgetfulness. Like a man carried away by beautiful music, we cease to think of how we look while listening. We are lost in the music itself. So it is with God. Humility is not the cringing thought that we are nothing, but the ecstatic realization that He is everything. The more one ponders humility, the more one sees that it is not merely one virtue among many, but rather the soil in which every virtue must grow. Take mercy, for instance. What is mercy but the willingness to stoop down, to lay aside one's pride and meet another in their weakness? Without humility, mercy is impossible, for pride would say, "This person is beneath me." Yet humility reminds us that we ourselves have been lifted from the dust by the mercy of God, and therefore we can kneel beside others without shame. Or consider gratitude. Pride convinces us that we deserve all that we have, that our successes are solely of our own making. Gratitude cannot breathe in that suffocating air. But humility opens the lungs of the soul. It teaches us to see every good thing as gift, every breath as grace. And once the heart is humble enough to recognize gift, it naturally sings with thanksgiving. Gratitude is the music of humility. Even joy is born in this soil. For joy is not the shallow pleasure of self-congratulation, but the deep gladness of forgetting oneself in the presence of what is good. Pride is always serious, for it cannot bear to be mocked. Humility is always capable of laughter, for it has no empire to defend. The devil, I think, cannot bear to be laughed at. But heaven rings with the laughter of the humble, for they are free to rejoice. Now, many people shrink from humility because they fear it will erase their identity. They imagine that to become humble is to become nothing, to lose the distinctiveness of their personhood. But it is the opposite. Pride reduces us, for it bends all our richness into a single, shrill note of self-absorption. Humility expands us because it allows God to bring out the full harmony of our being. You see, the proud man is like a mirror reflecting only his own face. The humble man is like a window through which the light streams in. In losing himself, he finds himself enlarged by God. And what of service? Christ told his disciples that the greatest among them would be the servant of all. Pride recoils at this, for it longs to be served. But humility delights in service, not because it despises the self, but because it loves the other. The humble man can wash another's feet without humiliation, for his dignity is not diminished by bending low. It is revealed. He knows that no task done in love is beneath him, because nothing done in the Spirit of Christ is small. If pride was the wound that fractured the world, you shall be like God. Then humility is the balm that begins its healing. It restores us to our proper posture as creatures, not gods, as children, not masters. In humility, we learn again what it is to walk with God in the cool of the day, unashamed, unburdened, free. It is telling that when Christ entered the world, he did not come in power and splendor, but in weakness and lowliness, a child laid in a manger. It is telling also that when he triumphed, it was not by climbing a throne, but by mounting a cross. Humility is not an ornament upon the Christian life. It is the very shape of the life of Christ. To follow him is to descend, that in the end we may be raised. I once remarked that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. And I stand by it still, for humility is the freedom to stand in the truth of who we are, beloved yet broken, finite yet destined for eternity, and to be so taken up by the love of God that self ceases to be our constant preoccupation. We do not lose ourselves in humility. We discover ourselves in God. And perhaps this is the ultimate secret. The humble shall be exalted, not because they sought greatness, but because they sought God. Pride sought to ascend and fell. Humility stooped and was lifted. Pride made hell. Humility opens heaven. Humility, as I see it, is both the gateway and the guardian of love. Without it, all our affections become distorted. Think of friendship. Pride corrupts it into rivalry, envy, and the endless comparison of status. But humility allows us to delight in the gifts of another without jealousy, to rejoice in their triumphs as though they were our own. Think of Eros, that mysterious union of man and woman. Pride twists it into possession and domination, but humility turns it into a mutual self-giving, where each finds joy not in conquest, but in surrender. Even charity itself, agape, the highest form of love, is impossible without humility. For to love as Christ loves is to descend, to stoop, to lay aside our rights for the sake of the beloved. If humility is so central, one might ask why it is so difficult to attain. The reason, I think, is that it runs directly contrary to the current of fallen human nature. Pride comes as easily to us as breathing. Humility feels, at first, like drowning. It is not natural to us in our present state, but it is supernatural, grace-born, God-given, Christ-shaped. We do not achieve humility by sheer discipline, but by proximity to God. The nearer we draw to Him, the clearer His light reveals our smallness, and yet the greater His love assures us of our worth. That double vision, our dependence and His mercy, forms the very essence of humility. I often imagine the proud soul as a clenched fist. It is tight, unyielding, determined to grasp and hold. But the humble soul is an open hand, empty perhaps, but ready to receive, ready also to give. And God delights to fill such hands with Himself. Now, some may protest that humility leaves one vulnerable, and they are right. The humble man does not armor himself with constant self-defense. He does not insist upon his rights at every turn. He is willing, even, to be overlooked. This, to the world, seems folly, but in the kingdom of God, it is strength. For the one who entrusts himself to God has nothing ultimate to lose. He may be humbled before men, yet he will be exalted by God. There is a wonderful irony here. The man who spends his life defending his own honor never rests, but the man who surrenders his honor to God is unshakably at peace. The proud heart must constantly polish its own image. The humble heart reflects the image of Christ without even trying. Pride is exhausting. Humility is restful. And what rest it is! Humility grants us the leisure to gaze outward, to marvel at the stars, to enjoy the laughter of a child, to find God's fingerprints in a wildflower or a hymn. The proud man cannot enjoy these things, for he is too busy calculating how they affect him. But the humble man is like one who has laid down a heavy burden, and is free at last to look around, to breathe, to wonder. Let us not mistake this rest for passivity. Humility does not mean we shrink from great deeds. Rather, it enables us to do them rightly, not for applause, not for self, but for God. The humble soldier may fight bravely, but he does not fight for his own glory. He fights because justice demands it. The humble scholar may labor over books, but he does not hunger for fame. He seeks truth for truth's sake. The humble mother, unnoticed by the world, may pour out her life for her children. In heaven, her crown will outshine the scepters of kings, and in the end, humility will not leave us stooped forever. The promise of Christ is sure. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. But that exaltation is not of our own contriving. It comes as pure gift. It is God lifting us, as a father lifts his child, placing us where we never could have climbed by our own striving. The proud scramble upwards only to fall. The humble kneel and are raised. So humility, far from being dreary or crushing, is in fact the hidden path to joy, freedom, and glory. It is the secret of becoming most fully alive, for it leads us out of ourselves and into the inexhaustible life of God. If we examine the great story of redemption, humility appears not as a footnote, but as the very heartbeat of God's work. The Incarnation itself is the supreme miracle of humility. For what could be more astonishing than that the Infinite clothed himself in finitude, that the Word through whom galaxies were spun should enter the world as a helpless child? Every stable, every manger, every Bethlehem carol whispers the same truth. God stooped, and having stooped, he did not cease stooping, down into the suffering of the sick, the rejection of his own people, the betrayal of his friends, the agony of Gethsemane, and the shame of the cross. We often imagine power as upward mobility, as the climb to thrones and titles. But in the gospel, power is revealed in descent. Christ's crown was woven of thorns before it could blaze with glory, and he calls us to follow, not by scrambling to the top of some imagined ladder, but by descending into love. Whoever would be great among you, he said, must be servant of all. This descent is not grim duty, but the paradoxical road to joy, for self-preoccupation is a prison, and humility alone holds the key. Have you not noticed that the proudest moments of your life are also the most anxious? You are never at rest while measuring yourself against others, never free while rehearsing how you appear in their eyes. Yet in the moments when you forget yourself altogether, when you are caught in beauty, or in laughter, or in love, you are happiest. That is humility, the freedom of self-forgetfulness. C.S. Lewis once wrote, and I speak here as though repeating what has long been upon my heart, that the door to hell is locked from the inside. Pride is that lock. We cling to ourselves so fiercely that we shut out the light of God. Humility is the hand that turns the key, that opens the door to the possibility of heaven. For heaven is not a hall of mirrors where we admire ourselves forever. It is the land of the self-forgetful, where God is all in all. Consider also the beauty of humility in community. A proud community is forever divided, each person guarding his own territory, his own recognition. But a humble community is like a choir. No voice seeks to drown the others. No instrument strives for dominance. Each part, however small, adds to the harmony of the whole. And the result is something far more beautiful than any solo performance, the music of the body of Christ. If we truly wish to know God, we must become humble, for the proud gaze can never see him rightly. Pride distorts even theology into self-congratulation, prayer into performance, and morality into self-righteousness. But humility opens the eye. It enables us to say with the psalmist, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" Not as a cry of despair, but as a hymn of wonder. We discover that God's greatness is not threatened by our smallness. Indeed, it is revealed by it. And this is the extraordinary promise, that humility does not end in abasement, but in exaltation. The humble are lifted, the meek inherit the earth, the last are made first. Humility is not the stripping away of dignity, but the preparation for glory. God does not humiliate his children. He humbles them only that he may raise them higher than they could dream. Imagine for a moment what a world of humble souls would look like. No jostling for position, no grasping after superiority, no anxious guarding of reputation. Instead, a world of people free to serve, free to love, free to rejoice in one another's gifts. Would it not be a foretaste of heaven itself? That is why I say humility is not optional for the Christian life. It is the air of the kingdom, the melody of eternity, the character of Christ himself. To seek humility is to seek Christ, and to find Christ is to find life abundant. It is worth noticing that humility is not a virtue we can possess in isolation. It cannot exist without relation to God and to others. You cannot be humble alone in a cave, congratulating yourself on how little you think of yourself. That is merely pride in disguise. True humility is revealed in the way we encounter others, how we speak, how we listen, how we forgive. It is tested in the irritations of daily life, far more than in grand gestures. To overlook a slight without bitterness, to receive correction without resentment, to let another shine without envy. These are the quiet triumphs of humility. And how subtle pride can be. It does not always roar like a lion. Sometimes it whispers like a serpent. It can disguise itself as virtue, pride in our humility, pride in our service, pride even in our spirituality. One may kneel in prayer with a heart swollen not with God, but with admiration of one's own piety. Humility, therefore, requires constant vigilance, not the vigilance of morbid self-scrutiny, but of turning again and again to Christ. For only in His presence can we see ourselves rightly, not inflated, not despised, but known and loved. Think of the saints of old. Their greatness did not consist in their achievements, though those were often remarkable. It consisted in their utter self-forgetfulness. They became transparent, so that when others looked at them, what shone through was not the saint, but Christ. Their humility was not a performance, but the natural fragrance of a life hidden in God. In a sense, humility is the art of standing in the right place. Pride puts the self at the center and demands that the world revolve around it. Humility moves the self aside so that God can take His rightful place at the center. And once He is at the center, everything else falls into harmony. Our neighbor is no longer a rival but a fellow worshiper. Our own talents are no longer trophies but tools. Even our sufferings are no longer meaningless burdens, but opportunities to participate in the humility of Christ. And how beautifully humility transforms suffering. The proud man asks, "Why should this happen to me?" And his suffering becomes embittered. The humble man says, "If even my Lord suffered, shall I expect exemption?" And his suffering becomes a fellowship with Christ. Pride isolates in pain. Humility unites us with the man of sorrows. Yet do not suppose that humility makes us joyless. On the contrary, it makes us radiant. The proud man cannot rejoice in another's success, but the humble man delights in it, as though it were his own. The proud man cannot laugh at himself, but the humble man does so gladly, for he knows that his dignity rests not in his perfection, but in God's love. Pride is a tight, clenched world. Humility is a wide, laughing meadow where the soul runs free. If ever you have watched a river, you will notice that it always seeks the lowest place. And yet, it is precisely because it flows downward that it can refresh the valleys, nourish the fields, and bring life wherever it goes. So it is with humility. By going low, it becomes fruitful. The proud stand tall but dry, bearing little fruit. The humble stoop, and the world is watered by their grace. At the last, humility prepares us for the only words that matter. Well done, good and faithful servant. For what is eternal life but to be welcomed into the joy of the Lord? And who can be welcomed except the one who has ceased to make much of himself and has begun to make much of God? The crown of humility is not shame but glory, not obscurity but radiance, not loss but gain. This, then, is the paradox that frames the Christian life. To descend is to ascend. To yield is to triumph. To humble oneself is to be exalted. The world cannot understand it, but heaven sings it as truth everlasting. If I may leave you with one final thought, it is this: humility is not a garment we put on for show, but the very atmosphere of life with God. It is not achieved in a day, nor is it perfected by our own efforts. It is, rather, the slow and steady work of grace, shaping us as water shapes the stone. Every act of surrender, every hidden deed of love, every prayer whispered not for recognition but for communion, all these are chisels in the hand of the Master, forming Christ within us. We must not despair if humility feels beyond our reach, for pride dies hard, and often it seems that the more we strive to be humble, the more pride clings to us. But the secret is not to look anxiously at ourselves, tallying our progress, but to look steadfastly at Christ. He is humility embodied, the eternal made temporal, the infinite made small, the holy made servant. To contemplate him is to be drawn little by little into his likeness. One day, when all things are revealed, we shall see that humility was not the dreary virtue we imagined, but the key that opened every door of joy. It was humility that made forgiveness possible, humility that kept love pure, humility that turned suffering into fellowship, humility that gave us eyes to see the world as God sees it. Pride builds kingdoms that crumble. Humility builds souls that endure forever. And when at last we stand before the throne of God, we shall not boast of what we have done. We shall not recite our achievements, nor display our credentials. We shall simply fall silent, humbled and yet radiant, for we shall know that everything we are is grace. And in that moment of perfect humility, we shall also find perfect joy, for our eyes will at last be fully lifted from ourselves and fixed forever on Him. Therefore, let us not fear humility, but seek it with gladness. For in learning to think of ourselves less, we do not diminish our humanity. We discover what it means to be truly human, creatures fashioned in the image of God, set free from the tyranny of self, and awakened to the vast wonder of His glory. The humble life is the joyful life, the peaceful life, the life that begins even now to taste eternity. If you take anything from my words today, let it be this: humility is not weakness, but strength, not sorrow, but gladness, not loss, but gain. It is the path of Christ, and therefore the path of life. To walk, it is to be freed, to be enlarged, to be made ready for the kingdom that cannot be shaken. And so, my dear friends, may we walk humbly with our God, and in doing so, may we find the joy that no pride could ever give. If you found these reflections meaningful, I invite you to like this video, share it with others, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to this channel, so that together we may continue to ponder the eternal truths that guide us home.